Welcome to the Mind Money Spectrum podcast, where your hosts, Aaron Ogti and Trishul Patel, go beyond traditional finance questions to help you explore how to use your money to achieve the freedom you want in life.
In this episode, Aaron and Trishul discuss New Year's resolutions. Well, not exactly. They relate how self-improvement doesn't need to coincide with an arbitrary date. They then go over different strategies to help nudge you towards sustainable habits, such as focusing on small incremental improvements and compounding, tracking your progress, and giving yourself 8 times longer to accomplish a goal. Success has more to do with discipline than motivation, so once you've made the commitment, just keep at it for the sake of doing it. After 8 years, you will look up and be impressed by the progress you have made. And now, on to our conversation.
Hi, my name is Aaron Ogti. I'm a financial advisor in the Bay Area, and I'm here with Trishul Patel, a wealth manager on the East Coast.
Hey, Aaron, great to be here today, and thanks everybody for listening.
Great to be here as well. Today, Trish and I are going to talk about New Year's resolutions. And if you're listening, it's probably end of November, beginning of December, and you're wondering, why are we talking about New Year's resolutions a month early? And one, we're planners. We tend to think of things in advance and like to actually, at least at the very least, put some thought into our decisions and actions moving forward. But also because Trish and I have talked about just human behavior and the way psychology works. And one of the things that kind of comes out of this is that making changes to habits is really, really hard for human beings. And we're hoping that if you listen to this a month before you're thinking about adopting a New Year's resolution and do it for that month, then there's a better chance that that resolution will actually stick. So we're going to talk about just kind of this idea of New Year's resolutions as a form of self-improvement, why they do or do not work, and sprinkle in a little bit of human behavior, behavioral finance, and some evolutionary psychology. So, Trishul, when you think of New Year's resolutions, have you done these in the past? I've honestly never thought about them a month in advance, but I haven't given that much thought in general anyways. But when you think of these New Year's resolutions, what are some of the things we need to be aware of if we actually want to go down this path?
Good introduction, Aaron. What it kind of brings to my mind is, as planners in the financial space, our goal is to be just more proactive about things rather than being reactive. And typically with the image of resolutions comes up probably more often than not on New Year's Day, where people really start thinking about it. And thinking about a long-term plan for the coming year as the ball is dropping may not be the best time to kind of get your ducks in a row with something like this if you want to increase your chances of success. So I think it's great that we're having this conversation a month or so early, so that if you're listening and you're really serious about coming up with some sort of goal, high level goal for the following year, that by following what makes the most sense and maybe some tips that we'll throw in over the course of this episode, will hopefully be able to increase our chances of success. So Aaron,
sounds good. I like it. Go ahead.
Right. So I was just gonna highlight, though, for myself, I like the idea of having a good long-term goal for over the course of a year. It's something that you can certainly look forward to, and it's a great feeling of accomplishment if you get it done. And I do have this for myself, but I guess I'll just throw in one thing to think about. At least for myself, I've never really timed it as the beginning of the year. It's just something like I may have a notion that starts, towards the beginning of a year. But for me, it's more about, when do I feel is a good time to kind of pull the trigger? And if I don't feel like I'm ready on Jan 1 or Feb 1 or March 1, it could take months. But, when I do feel ready, that's actually when I decide to go ahead and execute on something like this. And for me, I feel like planning ahead and not being too critical about the actual start date has helped me provide a better chance of success for myself.
Okay, that's kind of amazing. I had actually written down something almost exactly the same. I really do think about my own self-improvement. We've talked about this in the past, this idea of kind of always moving forward is a way to balance being content with your situation, which can lead to improved happiness. And therefore you're not disappointed by where you are, but also you need to keep trying to get better and kind of still have the ambition and the grit and drive to improve yourself. And it's kind of finding that balance between being happy with where you are, but still having the drive and ambition to be better in the future. It's hard to balance. And that idea of just kind of focusing on the improvement itself, improving yourself for the sake of improving yourself tends to be one of those better balances. And I actually wrote down it's the independent of the timing. I almost completely agree with that, where I have things that I want to work on to better myself, but I've never felt the attachment to January 1st. I've really never felt like, oh, this has to be a New Year's resolution. And I honestly did not expect you to say that, but I'll feel almost exactly the same of, yes, I want to be doing things that improve myself, whether it's between my career, physically, socially, psychologically, with my marriage, with my kids. That there's something I'm always kind of thinking about of how I move forward. I try and make sure I stop and smell the roses and I appreciate where I'm at. But I've never felt an attachment to January 1st. I almost wonder if there's some component there of it's almost like, why wait until January 1st to start the New Year's resolution, or putting pressure on yourself to start in January, and like adding that timing component might be a factor in increased failure?
It might be. Part of it is, just coming up with a plan and planning ahead. So if the plan itself is to provide some sort of opportunity for growth, frankly, I hear what you're saying. It can happen at any time. Why Jan 1? If you think of a great idea in the middle of the year and you feel like it'd be a good time to start then or a month from that time, it certainly doesn't have to wait.
So what are some of the things that others might have called resolutions that you call, I guess, more short term or intermediate term, or of course new goals? What are your resolutions that aren't actually resolutions, or other way around? What are your non-resolutions that are kind of like untimed resolutions?
Well, I guess for me, typically they revolved around this notion of, what would make me happier for the longer term. And they fall in line with what's pretty common for most people. In fact, the top 4 resolutions for people when it comes to New Year's is increasing exercise. And I've certainly fallen into that bucket. Being more conscientious about work or school. So, just performing better at one's work or career or academically. Then, of course, there's better habits when it comes to eating and things like that. I've certainly put focus on nutrition at various times in my life. And there are also other opportunities for improvement when it comes to, just health reasons. For example, with drinking, smoking, and caffeine, and, even other drugs that may pop up. These are the 4 common things that happen for individuals, and I can see why they made that list. For myself, what I typically do is just think about, what's kind of attainable at where I am now for the following, X period, and what am I kind of ready to take on. And, for some things, it may be something I want to get to, but I may, in fact, put it off for, half a decade or even 10 years if I feel I'm not quite ready.
I can see that. And as you kind of described that list, I heard some things that sound similar. I think it's coming from the past. I really like cookies, and related to that, I tend to like most other desserts. And when it comes to Thanksgiving and Christmas, I really enjoy the meals right along just as much as I enjoy spending time with friends and family. So I have noticed this kind of pattern of like I am using those holidays to enjoy myself, and so I do tend to gain a little weight come December, but then I go back to skiing in January and February, and I pretty consistently kind of lose the weight every spring-ish. Now that I think about it, I do wonder if just because it's cold and dark, I don't go outside and exercise or run as much during those times. And once daylight savings time starts or it starts to warm up a little bit, I might be just spending more time outside. I, but there again, it's not New Year's resolution specifically, but I do kind of make sure that I pay a little more attention to what I'm eating and get a little more exercise towards the beginning of the year, and then towards the end of the year, I tend not to specifically restrain myself or hold myself back. So yeah, I do sense the similarities to that list that you mentioned. But like we said, it's not necessarily tied to the timing of Jan 1 specifically. But I tend not to think in terms of the time frame you're talking about, like those really long time frames. I think it's too hard to predict what our lives might look like that far out. But I can think about those steps that need to happen maybe this year. Yeah, like I don't know if I have any 10-year goals, because I'd be thinking like in 10 years my oldest will be in college, so I'd like to be able to go visit her wherever she's going to college. That's the only thing I can really think of. So maybe it's age of my kids that I'm kind of focused on their growth more so than where I'll be in 10 years. I don't know how to think about that. Do you have examples of your 5 or 10-year time frame?
Yeah, I do. And they kind of fall in line with a few of the ones that came up on that top 4 list. So, for example, one of my earlier goals as I was, finishing up undergrad and my first master's program, I went into the job market, and one thing I kind of wanted to get right was my sleep. As a college student, you kind of just follow any random schedule that kind of falls into your lap based upon what's coming up over the following week. You probably heard the adage about in college, you have to, sleep, study, or party, but you only have time for 2 out of 3. So,
I remember, you know what? Now I think about it, in general, I was staying up late anyways. So I was probably sleeping from like 1 a.m. to 9 a.m., 2 a.m. to 10 a.m., something like that. And on the weekends, I'd probably be out with friends. And during the weekdays, I was actually writing papers that late.
Yeah, for myself, it was kind of all over the place. And for whatever reason, ended up, either pulling all-nighters or just being out late doing this or that, and sleeping in because you don't have a class until this time, but then waking up very early for that 6 a.m. class the next day. So frankly, I was all over the place. And I've heard this before, and I'm not sure of the exact facts, but my understanding is if you're 18, 19, 20, you frankly do need a lot more sleep than you're probably getting, and especially if you're a college student.
Mm.
So I certainly, for myself, felt like I was sleep deprived a lot of the time. So, it's one of those things that I put as a long-term goal, and I kind of worked for the next 2 or 3 years after starting my first job out of my master's program to kind of get that in line, to the point when a few years into that program, I just slowly inched forward to the point where I had a, consistent bedtime. I had a lot better sleep hygiene in terms of, a daily routine to kind of wind down. And it allowed me to also be a little more proactive on things that were a little more healthy around bedtime, instead of just falling asleep with, some sort of screen on. I started reading a lot more and things like that. But yeah, it took me, I just took my time to kind of get that in line, and it's something that's helped me ever since.
That's pretty impressive. I especially at that age, kind of have maturity and self-awareness to be able to focus on that kind of behavior change. I think at that time frame, I met my wife in college, so we were still together. I guess I think our emphasis would have been we had gotten a chocolate lab puppy the first year out of college, and we were taking the dog for long walks every night, like 2 or 3 hour walks from work, and it wasn't necessarily I like we really enjoyed those walks, and I think the benefits we did not see at the time, but in retrospect, it was things like, one, just being outside, and there's pretty good research that spending time outside is better for you. Two, we had the puppies. We knew the puppy needed to get exercise. Three, the walks were long enough that we were walking for several miles, and we were getting a decent amount of exercise. But it also is the communication between the two of us, like that kind of became our safe space for our marriage communication, where we would really focus on talking about things that were bothering us, and we would not get defensive regardless of what the other said. And doing that for several years before we had our first child really established foundation for our marriage, and actually feels really, really strong. And that chocolate lab passed away earlier this year, and we actually a few months later got a new puppy, and so now we're back to having those walks together. They're just happening at 7 a.m. or 7:30 a.m. because we have to work around kids' schedules. But I never thought of it as a resolution. But once we started up again this year, I realized it was something that we kind of missed. It was that time, just the two of us being outside, walking, and being able to talk about anything and everything. But yeah, it's so I know that's a not related to resolutions per se, but that's definitely a something that we've built that habit of. And while it doesn't necessarily apply to that list you're talking about, that has been really important in my life, and for me and my wife, that we've been
Well,
able to do for so long. Yeah.
yeah, I like that one. And even though it doesn't really sound like a resolution, and certainly it doesn't sound like a New Year's resolution, it does key in on, I think, the key word that kind of underpins this discussion, and that's like habit. The notion of forming a good habit, and or changing our habits to be better in line with what we want to do and where we want to get to.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I know once the dog got, it was really like the kids. Even when our first was born, we could still push around in the stroller. But I think once we had two, our oldest was then like 2 years old, and like she just didn't want to sit in the stroller. She wanted to play, but she also needed to get enough sleep, so we couldn't be out as late. And so we went for a long time without that consistent walk. It's only now that our kids are old enough we can leave them alone at home in the morning without worrying about them, that we've gotten back into that. But yeah, trying to restart that habit almost 7 or 8 years later was not easy. It did take a while of kind of setting alarms, making sure we're both getting up. It was also that's forced us to make sure we get to sleep just a little bit earlier, because during COVID, especially early on, it was really easy to just sleep in. The kids didn't have a specific sleep schedule. Our son wasn't going to daycare because that was closed. So we would make sure we got enough sleep, but a lot of times that meant sleeping in. And once they were back in school, our son's back in daycare, then kind of like what you thought, like we knew how important sleep was. So we actually focused on going to bed early so we could get up and do our walk. And that was not an easy part, but we've done enough that we have built up that habit. So are there anything that for you that you can think of that it took you a while to build a specific habit towards some of these goals of self-improvement?
Yeah, like I mentioned, there have been a few things that I've put off a very long time. Like, for example, I had probably an intention to exercise more, not necessarily in college, because again, just a little too busy. So it got a very small slice of my time. But after graduating, I did include a slice for exercise, but I also realized if I wanted to make meaningful progress on that, I would need a larger level of commitment. So in fact, I didn't make the 5-year plan cut. It was more part of the 10-year plan. It's okay in my mind if somebody doesn't feel ready for something. I've kind of told myself that. I've given myself space to understand that not everything has to be fixed overnight. We have a lifetime for improvement. And also it's okay to understand that you're climbing up this mountain towards the peak of happiness. There's going to be dips and valleys and rough terrain. So it's not going to be, like a straight escalator or stairway to happiness heaven. So when it comes to habits, what I've also kind of realized is that you've probably heard this before, where it kind of takes a month or so to have an activity become a habit, but it's also becoming clear that if you really want something to stick, it's going to take longer than that. If you really want an activity to become part of your personality, then probably targeting something like 6 months is more realistic. And for some of these things, if the goal is really for it to be part of your personality, meaning that this is going to be part of who you are on a go forward basis, then it kind of means two things. You want to do it for the long term, you want it to last, but also you want to give yourself enough time to let that challenge happen or flow into place. And what this kind of reminds me of is in my computer science program, I took this course in project management, and I remember that there was a lecture about just being realistic and setting realistic goals. And that's one of the lectures that's really stuck with me all throughout my career. And frankly, it's kind of underpinned how I kind of approach things that are challenging in nature. And what my professor at the time, what he kind of related is, first he started off with the notion that 50% of all technology projects fail. So, that's just something that we need to accept. Technology is hard to implement. There's a lot of things going on and a lot of moving parts and a lot of things to integrate. And it's just not always successful. So that we have to keep that in mind. Now, it doesn't mean we should throw it out, because obviously we know technology can help us quite a bit. But then the other thing he related was also powerful to me. He said, as a project manager, we have to realize that when we're estimating how hard a project is just full of biases, to the point where if we're trying to come up with an estimation, for example, on how long will this software initiative take, well, looking at the data, it turns out that whenever an estimation is put forward by a professional manager, it ends up taking twice as long. But not only that, it ends up costing twice as much. And not only that, it ends up taking twice the amount of resources. So 2 times 2 times 2 is 8. So typical projects in the technology space end up being 8 times more complex than initially envisioned. And that kind of underpins why 50% of projects fail. It's this understanding that you really need to understand when you're taking on something complex. The human brain has this propensity to be a little optimistic, maybe a little starry-eyed about things. And that's not a reason to, understanding that is not a reason to not try, but it's just an opportunity to just be realistic on setting expectations for yourself. So for myself, I've followed that kind of 8X philosophy when it comes to managing big projects, that I've been in charge of throughout my career. Just being realistic with, okay, in my mind, I think it takes a week. Well, okay, I'd tell my supervisor that's going to take 8 weeks. And or 8 times the amount of whatever I'm thinking in my mind. And that allowed a few things. That allowed me to increase my success rate, and it gave me the opportunity to kind of underpromise and overperform. Meaning, if I say we can do it and this is what it's going to take, then there's a good chance we'll meet that. But mainly it's because I've set the bar so that there is room for all the things that will inevitably come up. And I found that applying this type of notion to how I've handled creating habit, for example, or putting something in place that I feel would increase my chances of success in my personal life, I think this has been helpful from that perspective.
I remember at my former firm, I had some of those specific issues of it was kind of time management, but it really was related to like those setting expectations of estimate of how long it's going to take. So something would come across my plate. It's like, okay, this will take me an hour of work. I'll get it done today. But then something else comes. Okay, this will also take an hour of work. And between other things I can get it done. I'll give a day. But then like once I had like 3 things, okay, so each time I was like, okay, I'm telling the person who's asking it, I'll get it to you tomorrow, except that one of them would be early, one would be on time, and one would be late. And kind of that having it was kind of consistently enough. And there was also I had issues with kind of prioritization from different sources. So kind of which is more important, which needs to get done now, or even though this takes me an hour, say half a day, or kind of because there's always other things, but a devoted day of work, I'm not going to be able to start it for a week. So it'll take me like one day, but that's starting a week later. So I'll get to in like a week and a half, so something like that. Like that was one of the things I had to learn. Actually, a time management coach was able to really help me with that, to kind of think about that. Also, prioritization came into effect where, okay, this is what I'm working on now. Do I need to pause this and work on this new thing? Or do I finish this and start the new thing the next day? And kind of understanding that prioritization. Those were some things that I was pretty bad at. But over time, just like you said, adding a lot of time to when it's expected to be done, just because so many other things will come into play. There's other scheduling, other prioritizations, things that need to happen immediately come up. But that was one area that it did take a while to get better at. I think another thing when I think about the self-improvement, and this kind of gets back to those goals and New Year's resolutions. I think I've never really set specific goals, but I do have a pretty good internal sense of doing one more, like get improving 1%, kind of that thing. It's the idea of kind of if you can improve 1% per day, then in 50 days, you're 50% better. In 100 days, you've doubled where you were. And the math isn't quite like that, but just that concept of getting 1% better every day. And that has worked for me, where I'm not trying to get to a certain goal, but I am kind of trying to focus on the grit to just push myself just that one extra. And one of the things that over the last, I think so during COVID, so probably the last few months, I've been trying to do just one more pull-up. So before I take a shower, I have a pull-up bar in my bathroom. I'm going to try to do one more pull-up. And over the 9 months or so, I got up to 11 pull-ups. And that's just, right now I could probably do 9 or 10 because I went on vacation and kind of lost it. But like that's one of those things I think about, is I never set the goal of getting to X number of pull-ups. I did set the goal of doing one more. And that's been something I've been able to kind of be proud of, that I'm now able to do more pull-ups than I've ever been able to do in my life. I also did a little bit for juggling. For most of my life, I've never been able to juggle. Last summer, the summer before, we were spending a lot of time outside in the backyard with kids. And I was trying to show them that if you start from nothing and you just keep practicing, and you go out the next day and you keep practicing, you go out the next day and you keep practicing, you'll eventually be able to do it. And I decided to pick juggling because it was something they could see me get better at over time. But it's like my goal wasn't to be able to juggle X number of balls for Y number of minutes. It's just like go out and just get just a little bit better. And I'm not good by any means, but I can do something that kind of looks like juggling now. But I was curious, is there something that you think about, like that goal or that target that you are working towards, or that general compounding improvement?
I really like that compounding notion. It's something where it ties into finance, because we've kind of said this before. The most powerful force in the universe is compound interest. And, that's just the notion of, you take anything and you compound it. After a finite amount of time, it will be growing exponentially to the point where the growth will be so huge, it gets almost silly. Now, we're human, so we don't have that level of possibility, but there, for everything we do, but there is opportunity for just small incremental growth that over a long enough time frame can make a huge difference. And I like it, what you mentioned about the pull-ups. That's pretty neat. And I also like what you mentioned about the juggling, because yes, it doesn't probably provide any of your lifelong check boxes, but it does provide fulfillment, and it is giving you, again, the opportunity to provide your children with an example of grit, which I think is also very neat. When I think about just the small incremental change, it reminds me of our conversations about nudge, and the notion there is, if you want to create great change, it kind of happens one small step at a time. And often these small behavioral changes, if they can just inch you in the right direction, that's enough to provide a pretty strong improvement over time. We've also mentioned this before, but I want to highlight it in this context. It's something that I've heard before, and it's kind of stuck with me over the years when it comes to just this notion of improvement in general. And when I first read it, it was kind of impactful to me. It kind of just goes like this. It says that motivation on its own is highly overrated. In fact, motivation is probably not going to get you very far. when we all think about accomplishing something, we think about, motivating ourselves and getting hyped up about it. And, what this individual was trying to say is that that'll kind of get you there, but it won't keep you there. It'll get you to the gym the first time, the second time, but motivation as a driver for change with humans is actually pretty fickle. It doesn't last too long. What really matters is discipline.
Hmm.
The notion that you're doing something not because you're motivated to do it, you're doing something for the sake of forming that habit, for just doing it. That's what's probably going to get you to that end goal, rather than doing something just because you really want to do it, because that really want is feeling is probably not going to last, especially if it's something that you want to endure or change over a long period of time.
I like that phrase. Kind of, you have to internalize doing something for the sake of doing it. You're not doing it for any external reason or outside influence. You're doing it for the sake of doing it itself.
Yeah. So if you really are serious about a long-term change, then there are going to be periods where you're just going to be questioning yourself left, right, up, down, and sideways about it. And motivation may have been there, on that first day or that second week or and so on. And it may even come back later on, but there will be periods where you just don't want to do it. But what's going to make that habit stick is having the discipline to say, I'm just going to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. So for listeners who are starting to think of maybe not making New Year's resolutions come January, but other changes or habits or improvements, do you have any other kind of things for them to think about?
Well, also as it relates to nudge and just providing some sort of way to increase your chances of success. We've talked about a few of these tips before, like if you're doing something really tough, kind of reward yourself while you're doing that activity. Aaron, I think you mentioned like when you jog, you watch your favorite show on the treadmill.
Yes, when I'm on the Stairmaster, I watch Silicon Valley. And so I, because I don't know, something happened, but I probably haven't watched an episode in like 6 months because I haven't been on the Stairmaster. I've been doing other things. So yes, I'm a season and a half behind, but I'll get there. I want to know what happens, and I don't want it to be spoiled, so I know I'll get back on the Stairmaster at some point.
Right. So these incremental rewards can help. I remember when I started running earlier this year, that's something I mentioned in an earlier podcast. It's something I wanted to form a habit of. And what I did for myself is I printed out a calendar, put it on the wall, and every day I ran, I put an X on that box. And just watching those X's accumulate over time, it's just a little bit of gamification, the notion of just adding a little reward, like a video game, to encourage me to keep going. And it kind of helped. It helped me pass that 1 month hurdle and that 6 month hurdle, to the point where this type of cardio exercise is more a part of my personality now.
Didn't you have an injury at some point that kind of slowed you down or forced you to stop for a little bit?
Yeah, I did. When I first started running, what I kind of related is just I did it well for like a week or two, and then both of my knees kind of gave out because they were screaming at me saying, "What are you trying to do? You haven't done this in 40 years."
So can you think about how you made sure to get back to it? Because I feel like that's the a really, really good example of how so many others like habits tend to fall off. It's outside your control. It was an adversity, and it would have made complete sense if it takes you 2 weeks to recover, for your knees to recover before you're really comfortable running again, but you filled that time with something else and you don't actually get back to it. Like that would make a lot of sense. And so I'm really curious how you kind of either had the discipline or made sure you got back to running to get back to that habit forming.
Right. So the two key things I did is, first, I changed up my plan from, instead of running, 3, 4 days a week, I turned it down to like 1 or 2. but I made sure there was time within a given week. And also I didn't run, I walked, that's all I could do. So, but the point is I did something that aligned with that long-term goal for that activity that I could start building up again, 1% better each time.
I actually love that, especially kind of the willingness to admit that taking on too much can kind of harm all of the things. But if you just kind of focus on that one little thing, and if you can't do the full thing, then do the approximation, because at that point you're not necessarily walking for cardiovascular long-term health benefits. There's some. You're actually walking to maintain the time in your schedule and the habit, and the once your knees are ready, you can get back to running. You didn't go from running to doing errands around the house. You went from running to walking in response to that adversity.
Yeah, and part of it was just the understanding that there would be kind of ups and downs over as my intention to put this into more of my personality. But I realized to get there, I would need to just have the discipline to just do it, kind of even when I'm not motivated to do it.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not a big runner. I really don't like running. I've had conversations with another friend. During COVID, we'll meet every Thursday and we have some kind of sport or activity, and we'll create some kind of competition that serves as our workout, because neither of us enjoy running, but we actually like the competition and playing sports and being active. So we try and find some kind of competition we can add. But I have heard other runners talk about goals of trying to get so many miles in a month or so many miles in a year. I was wondering if you ever considered that or tried that, because I don't know if it would feel counter to what we're talking about, but maybe if you broke down that goal of you're trying to get, say, 500 miles in a year, which is more than a mile per day, you have to kind of break it down to, okay, I need to get 10 miles per week, whether that's three 3-mile runs or two 5-mile runs, something like that. I'm curious, was there any number associated with your running, or was it, I want to get out moving for certain minutes or hours per day?
It's interesting because I think the goals I put into place were nothing too grand, but just I let myself consider, what if I were just a little bit better than where I am now, or when, where I was at any given time. So to kind of put that into context, when I started, my goal was kind of, can I make it a quarter of the way through the trail without having to stop?
Mm.
I couldn't do that. I could probably run 300 feet max when I first started. And, then I just ensured, can I make it halfway through the trail without stopping, and then 3/4 and so on. And then felt really good after a month or two, where it's one of those things I had to run back home and tell my wife, I just ran that whole thing without stopping. It's the first time I've done that. And then slowly started to, at that point, start tracking time. Before, it used to take me a whole hour to do the 1.5 miles. And by the end of it, when I first started tracking time, it was a good 20 minutes, even though it's like a fast paced walk at that point. And I've been able to shave that down over time. And I got to the point where I could easily run that mile and a half in a time that is probably sensible for someone my age, which is something I've never been able to do. And it's interesting because now it's getting colder here. So now that winter's on our shoulders, I had to kind of transition a bit. So my new game plan is to just kind of exercise a few days a week.
Based on our conversation, I feel like you have to get slightly more specific, but you have a month to figure out what that slightly more specific is.
I've kind of already started. So my wife was working with a personal trainer via Zoom, and I've jumped in with her. So I've been doing that for a month with her now.
Okay. But I do think there's something you said there that I remember when we were starting up our businesses, going through different coaching and trainings and getting registration set up. One of the things I took, and I've took it from other podcasts and other business ideas, that people will focus on whatever they track. So as it relates to advisory businesses, there were most advisors, kind of because we have to report its regulators, they track assets under management. That's the requirement. So that ends up being a driver for most of other firms. Another advisor was talking on a podcast how he tracks how many days off he's been able to spend with his kids. And so because he's tracking it, that ends up becoming his kind of, I don't want to say motivation because that might be a loaded word, but it ends up being the thing that he is working towards without necessarily, it feels like it's spelling effort. He's kind of, again, internalizing that. And I do think that as it pertains to other behavior change type situations, that's one of the reasons why weighing yourself every day, if your goal is weight loss, just the act of doing that will help you think about all the little things throughout the day that will making healthier decisions, knowing that you're weighing yourself every day. And you also kind of get really quick feedback of, oh, this was a bad decision yesterday because I can see the result, that kind of thing. And I can see kind of, for me, it was the pull-ups, or I'll do wall sits because I want to build up muscles for ski season, or I'll do squats or push-ups, something like that. But for you, you talked about like you had this tracking mechanism of how far you could run before you had to stop. And because you're doing the same path, you can see, oh, yesterday or last time I got this far, I have to go just a little bit farther. And so you didn't have to write it down. You didn't have to make a note on your phone. You can you've added that. Although once you got to start timing yourself, then you have to introduce some kind of watch or cell phone timer. But if like kind of thinking about that personal record, your PR, like anytime you have something that you're tracking and you make the tracking part easy, you end up working towards that and it doesn't feel like you're trying to. That's one of the reasons why when I talk to clients about spending, budgeting and trying to restrict tends not to work. It tends to, like, they might hold on to it for 1 to 3 to 6 months, but eventually they'll go back to the same thing. I just ask that they track their spending because that gives us good data on, okay, here's how much you're spending over the year. Here's how much we need to save to support that lifestyle, et cetera. But just tracking their spending. It sounds like for you, I don't know if it was intentional or not, because you are tracking how far you could run and then tracking your time, you have been improving because on the things that you're focusing on the things that are, you've made those things important. And so those are the things that you're focusing on and improving.
Yeah, that does make sense to me. And I like the way that you phrased it. Even though it wasn't necessarily intentional or even set out from the beginning, it does have that benefit of, now that your mind has the data to play with, it's also taking up, just mind share in general to let the subconscious kind of ponder what's going on there. And on its own, it might just provide some benefit of just being a little more mindful of what one might consider doing in response to the data without even, like you said, being fully intentional about it.
So given that our listeners, if they were going to adopt something new in the next, and then maybe it happens in January, maybe it happens before, maybe it happens later, but what are some kind of summarizing points that you can think of? Like I'm thinking like the small steps, like those nudges, like just that improving for the sake of improving, or the doing the thing for the sake of doing it. but just the small incremental improvements, maybe not taking on too much, whatever you think you're trying to do, start tracking that, and that'll become your driver. Like what are some of the things that either that we've talked about or that you also have for what they can be thinking about over the next month or so?
Well, good stuff, Aaron. Yeah, I think in addition to that, it's just this notion of planning ahead. It doesn't necessarily have to be Jan 1, but if you're just planning on making a big change, give yourself plenty of time, plan ahead, and come up with a plan that you think is sensible, and then multiply by 8.
That's right. I like that. I like that. That's a good number. It's not too big, but it's definitely big enough.
Yeah, and the notion is even if it takes you 8 years to accomplish this goal of losing weight, you still have that whole lifetime beyond that to enjoy it, rather than still be struggling to get off the launch pad 8 years from now.
I like that. That's yeah. If you can, instead of changing New Year's resolution to even a 1 month or a 3 month goal, if you give yourself 8 years to accomplish something, and so like the classic New Year's resolution, I want to lose 15 pounds, so I need to lose a pound every 2 weeks to reach my goal within a reasonable time frame, and definitely by summer. Whereas we're talking about like, no, don't give yourself 6 months. Give yourself 8 years to lose 15 pounds. You got to lose 2 pounds per year.
I like that so much. It makes so much sense to me, because if you think about somebody who tries to lose those 15 year after year versus the person who just says, oh, look, I lost 2 pounds this year.
Yeah.
But literally you look at those two people 8 years from now, and the one who's trying to aim for that 2 pounds, they probably didn't have to make a major change in their life that was noticeable. 1% change a month would have probably done it. But the chances of success after 8 years seems like a lot higher for that individual who maybe didn't need to overhaul their life to get there.
Yeah. I do really like that. You want to accomplish something this year? You give yourself 8 years, but focus on like, how are you going to get that 1% difference, that 1% change? So
yeah, right.
Well, thank you very much, Trishul. Is there anything else you want to add before we head out today?
No, I enjoyed this conversation. I think, it's motivated me to just think of a few things that might be useful, and hopefully I'll have the discipline to kind of put them into effect for myself.
It did make me wonder what happens in the last season of Silicon Valley, and I'll have to get back on the Stairmaster to find out.
Well, I give you 8 years to
Thank you. That's what I needed. Thank you. That's what I needed. Oh, okay. This is good. This is really good. Thank you, Trishul.
Well, thanks, Aaron. And thanks, everybody, for listening. If you're enjoying these conversations, do subscribe to our podcast. Okay, thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
We appreciate you joining us today for this episode of the Mind Money Spectrum podcast. Be sure to visit mindmoneyspectrum.com to access the entire library of episodes. Remember, it's not black and white, but the wide spectrum of gray area where you get to pursue the freedoms you want in life. Opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and is no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested in directly. Have a nice day.